Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I'm humbled and privileged, as the speaker earlier this morning said. I'm humbled and privileged to be here. I have a lot of materials to go through today. This is about the Portland Peak Oil Task Force report. About 1 year ago, the Portland City Council appointed a task force to look into the implications of peak oil for the city of Portland. And I work for the Oregon Department of Energy, and I was appointed loaned by the department to provide lead staff support to the city of Portland as they did it. The Portland City Council passed the resolution, and they appointed 12 members to the task force. This represents a cross-section of the community in Portland. And the chairman of the task force was a former director of the State Economic Development Department. Another member was a former director of the State Land Use Department. And we had social worker, farmer, and various other people on the task force. The task force broke into 4 subcommittees. We looked at the issue and realized, energy is behind everything we do. It's behind everything. So they said, how do you grapple with an issue like that? So they decided to break into these 4 task forces: land use, transportation, economy, meaning business and jobs, public services, and food and agriculture. We laid out a couple of ground rules at the beginning of the process. Number 1 was there is not going to be any debate about if or when peak oil is happening. We accept that peak oil will happen. We don't know when it will happen, but it really doesn't matter. As the Hirsch report indicated, you need 15 to 20 years to prepare for it. We need to start preparing, even if some of the projections here that we've heard about the delayed peak were to come true. It would be a luxury. We cannot squander the time in the meantime like we have squandered the last 30 years. Secondly, in debt, recognizing our debt to Jim Kunstler, we stole the term long emergency. That is indeed what we're facing. There will be shocks along the way, but we are preparing for a long emergency. Third ground rule is there is no magic bullet supply alternatives. If people believe that there is a magic supply alternative, why are we even here? The market would take care of it. One of the other ground rules is we would deal with impacts first and then the recommendations. We walked into the very first meeting and people started throwing recommendations on the table, and some members said, time out, we need to identify what the impacts are. The solutions need to be tailored to the impacts. We need to have solutions for every impact. You can't have recommendations divorced from the impacts. Looked at a number of different scenarios, distinguished by the severity of the impacts and the speed with which the impacts will have an onset. And the task force decided to focus on the long-term transition, realizing it would be a gradual slide and hoping that the impacts would be less severe. For the more severe impacts, where you're really talking about scenarios of disintegration, we figured, number 1, we have a limited ability to respond in that case. And secondly, it's our goal, it's our task to prepare and prevent that scenario from playing out. The impact pathways that we identified, I think, are pretty straightforward. You've got fuel shortages, which lead to price increases, primarily in the sectors of transportation, manufacturing, and food. That leads to economic impacts, less consumer spending, which will then lead to business failure, and hardships for vulnerable and marginalized populations. That in turn has social impacts, individual stress, social conflict, more demand for social services, less government revenue. And hopefully there are some opportunities within it as well, demand for efficient products and services, stuff like that. The key questions that we looked at in the Transportation and Land Use Task Force were, first of all, how will freight move? Secondly, how will people move? How will they get to work and to other places, but primarily to work? And thirdly, how will land use be affected by peak oil? And perhaps more importantly, how can we use land use to address some of the problems that will come up in peak oil? Some of the impacts that we came up with, that we identified, first and obvious one, of course, is there's going to be less automobile travel, and people are going to seek transportation alternatives. Secondly, people and businesses will probably relocate. We figured there will probably be some kind of a movement toward the central part of the city. That helps in terms of density, but there are also problems related to that. You're going to get some movement of people that currently inhabit the inner cities moving to the, I forget the term, to the fringe of the cities, to some of the areas that have been abandoned. There will be pressure for increased densities and mixed uses. Freight costs will increase, and as a result, freight modes will travel more to rail and boat. Air travel will decline, as we heard this morning. Key questions for Food and Agriculture Subcommittee were how will food availability, prices, quality, and choices be affected? And how will food production, processing, transportation, and distribution be affected? The impacts are the amount and the variety of food will decrease. We are not going to get, as we've heard, we're not going to get strawberries from Chile in January. Secondly, we're going to have higher prices. Food will cost more to produce, process, and transport. There will be other impacts on diet and nutrition, shifts in food retailing patterns. There will be more household food production and preservation, less waste in packaging. Some of those impacts are actually something we probably should be looking forward to. Key questions for the Economics Committee related to business and jobs was 3 key questions. How will production costs be affected? Secondly, how will demand for the product or service be affected? Is it discretionary or critical? And are there reasonable substitutes for it? And the third question was, how will upstream supplies be affected? We tried to invite some of the major businesses in the Portland area into the process, and were actually turned down by quite a few of them. The response was, oh, energy is 1 or 2% of our operating costs. It's not going to matter. And they didn't realize that, you need to look at, is there even going to be a demand for your product in the future? Or what about the upstream supplies? Are you going to be able to get the raw materials or some of the critical subcomponents to your products? The impacts, unemployment, inflation, recession. As we heard yesterday, 1970s on steroids. The problems will be more systemic, will be more persistent, and will not be prone to conventional economic solutions. There will be higher production and distribution costs for businesses. I've talked about the upstream supply and demand. There will be business failures, unemployment, and probably some kind of a shift to more local production. Again, that may be a good thing, but we're going to have to become, not totally self-sufficient. Hopefully we'll never get to that point, but more so than we currently are. We looked specifically at some impacts on the traded sector. The traded sector is critical to local economies. The traded sector is those businesses that produce products for export to different regions or out of the country. It is what brings money into the Portland area. It brings money in from outside that you can then buy other products and services that you do not make or produce at home. And the key traded sector industries in the Portland area are high-tech, transportation equipment, apparel manufacturers, special metal products, and nursery products. We also looked at construction and service sectors because they are such large employers of people. Now, with a lot of these, we didn't really identify a lot of the specific impacts. We were trying to get the businesses in, but what we want to try to do is provide a template, a model for them so that they can go out and identify the impacts on their businesses. We need to trigger them to think through those issues themselves. Like I say, the upstream supply, the downstream consumer demand. For the public and social services, key questions were how will demand for services be affected, and how will the ability to provide those services be affected? And we looked at a range of public and social services ranging from healthcare and public health to housing, food, police, fire, water, wastewater, municipal solid waste, and electricity. The key impacts, one of the main impacts of the whole study was that vulnerable and marginalized populations will be hit first and hardest. And that needs to sink in. They're the ones who are going to be hit. Those of us who have some level of comfort and luxury will certainly feel the impacts, but we will not feel the impacts like they will. Systems that are already stressed, such as our healthcare system, will be stretched to the max, stretched to the limit. One of the other real key findings that we came up with is the risk of fractured community networks. As people wind up relocating or get into dire straits, they will lose contact with friends, family, stuff like that. Networks that have taken long to build up, support networks will not be there anymore. Impacts on public and social services, healthcare, public health. Healthcare is a big issue. As employment goes down, profits are stretched, profit margins are stretched to the limit. Businesses will not provide insurance for their workers anymore. So what are they going to do? Well, they're not going to get preventative care. What does that mean? It means the healthcare system is going to be flooded with people coming in for emergency services. So you're going to have effects like that. On housing, people are going to go from home ownership, they're going to go down the housing ladder, from home ownership to rentals, from rentals to housing assistance. People who are in housing assistance may be bumped out onto the streets or into homeless shelters. I'll just flag through a couple of these here real quickly. I'll get into the recommendations now. The recommendations really fall into two main categories. Number one, we wanted to reduce exposure to the city, to some of the impacts that are going to be felt. And secondly, is we wanted to strengthen community cohesion. First key recommendation is really a goal. It's not a recommendation, it's a goal. It's to reduce oil and gas use by 50% in 25 years, consistent with the oil depletion protocol. I'm not sure that's really a goal. That may wind up being reality. We all may be doing that whether we like it or not. Like I say, if we actually have a delayed peak, maybe we can get ahead of the curve. Secondly, we need to inform our citizens. We need to build awareness. We need to unite people around a vision and mobilize their creativity. Government is not going to provide the answers for people. They're going to have to come up with a lot of it themselves. Same with businesses. What government can do is to give them a vision and to set the framework in place so they can be creative. Thirdly, we need to engage the civic leadership. We need to build awareness among decision makers and opinion leaders. And we need to spur government and corporate planning and preparation. Again, we need to get government and corporations to look at the consumer demand, look at upstream supply. Fourthly, we need to get land use patterns in place that reduce transportation needs, promote walkability, and provide easy access to services and transportation options. The city supports the direction that the Portland metropolitan area is already going in concept C over there, which is neighboring cities and neighborhood centers. Rather than encouraging all the development to go into a dense downtown core, we want neighborhood centers scattered throughout the city. We want smart infrastructure investments, provide transportation options, light rail like we heard this morning, options like that, facilitate movement of freight, preserve some of the sites that have access to intermodal modes of transportation, water, rail, as well as highway, and prevent the stranded infrastructure investments. And I want to harken back to Mr. Bezdek's presentation this morning. The Port of Portland is looking at expanding the Portland Airport, adding a new runway and a terminal. Those are the kind of investments we need to look at and say, is that $20 billion that's going to be well spent? They need to rethink some of those options. Sixthly, we need to encourage efficient renewable transportation choices. We need to get people out of their cars, provide easy access to alternative modes of transportation, and encourage the use of biofuels. We need to expand energy efficiency programs. When I say expand them, I mean we need to dramatically ramp up what we have done. I've worked for 25 years at the Oregon Department of Energy. We are leaders in a number of renewable energy and energy efficiency programs, and what we have done is a drop in the bucket. I mean, it is a drop in the bucket what we need to do. Eighth, we need to preserve local food capability. We need to get land use policies in place that preserve nearby agricultural land. We're going to need some of that land for food instead of for subdivisions. We also need to get incentives in place to support the local food processing industries. I'll skip some of these. Ninth, we need to promote sustainable business opportunities, encourage businesses to locate in Portland or develop that serve renewable energy and energy efficiency. Again, Portland is already a leader in sustainable design. We need to encourage that as well as other related businesses and industries. We also need to identify import substitution opportunities. Some products that we can produce that are currently brought in from elsewhere, we need to begin to provide those for ourselves. 10th, we need to preserve the safety net, sense of community, health care, preventative care, public health system, on and on, you know the routine, transportation services, etc. But one of the key ones there, I'll get to that in a second. 11th, emergency planning. We need to get emergency planning in place. There will be shocks along the way. While it is a long emergency, there will be spikes, there will be shocks, things that happen. We need to be prepared to deal with those. How do you allocate fuel? How do you provide food, distribute food, and how do you provide transportation, get people to and from their jobs? In conclusion, one of the Yeah, just don't stay too long, okay? You know, the more people that come and stay, the less they're going to come, well, the less of a place is going to be that people want to come to. One of the key findings, though, just in conclusion, one of the key findings was we need to preserve a sense of community and civility. We cannot go on our own individual ways. If we do that, we have lost the game. We need to maintain our sense of cohesion. We are all in this together, and once we start splintering, it's all over. Thank you.